In the foothills of the Himalayas, where the greatest mountains on earth meet the fertile plains of the Ganges River, there existed a kingdom so small it would fit inside a modern city. Yet from this modest realm of the Sakya clan, in the year 563 before the Common Era, would emerge a man whose insights would touch more lives than any emperor's sword could reach. Consider for a moment the accident of geography. The Buddha was born not in the great cities of his age, not in Babylon or Athens or the rising power of Rome, but in a borderland between kingdoms, in a place where ideas flowed like water through mountain valleys. The Gangetic Plain, in the 6th century before the Common Era, was alive with spiritual experimentation. Wandering philosophers debated in marketplaces. Ascetics sat beneath trees, testing the limits of human endurance. The old Vedic certainties were crumbling, and in that creative chaos, new visions of human possibility were taking root. The child who would become the Buddha entered this world as Siddhartha Gautama, born to King Suddhodana and Queen Maya of the Sakya clan. His very name meant, "he who achieves his aim," a prophecy wrapped in syllables. Legend tells us that his mother, travelling to her father's home for the birth as custom required, paused in a garden at Lumbini. There, standing and holding the branch of a sal tree, she brought forth a son who would one day hold up the very sky of human understanding. But prophecy arrived with the child. When the sage Asita came to examine the newborn prince, he wept, not from sorrow at what he saw, but from joy mixed with profound regret, for he recognized in the infant the 32 marks of a Mahapurusha, a great being destined for extraordinary achievement. "This child," Asita declared, "will become either a universal monarch who conquers through righteousness, or a fully enlightened Buddha who conquers suffering itself." The old sage's tears fell, because he knew he would not live to hear the teaching this child would one day proclaim. King Suddhodana heard the prophecy with a father's ambition and a ruler's dread. He wanted a son who would inherit his kingdom, who would extend Sakya power across the plains, who would die remembered as a great king. He did not want a son who would abandon throne and crown to wander homeless, seeking invisible truths. And so the king made a decision that would echo through history. He would shield his son from every shadow, hide every hint of suffering, create a paradise so perfect that Siddhartha would never dream of looking beyond its walls. Imagine the resources this required. 3 palaces were constructed, one for the hot season, one for the cold season, one for the rains. Each was filled with everything that could delight a young prince. Musicians and dancers entertained him. Poets composed verses in his honor. The finest teachers instructed him in the arts expected of a warrior nobleman: archery, swordsmanship, horse riding, wrestling, philosophy, mathematics. The gardens bloomed eternal spring. No dead leaf was permitted to fall where Siddhartha might see it. No aged servant, no sick person, no whisper of death was allowed near the prince. It was a cage built of gold and flowers, and for nearly 3 decades it held. The young Siddhartha excelled at everything. In tournaments, he demonstrated prowess that became legendary. When the Sakyas held contests to choose a husband for Yasodhara, the beautiful daughter of a neighboring clan, Siddhartha won every trial. He outshot the finest archers, his arrow passing through 7 trees in succession. He lifted and threw weights that other young warriors could barely move. He displayed mastery of the arts of war and peace alike. And when he won Yasodhara's hand, it seemed the prophecy of kingship would fulfill itself after all. But here is what his father could not understand. You cannot wall off truth forever. You cannot build ramparts tall, enough to keep out the fundamental facts of existence. Life, with all its inevitable sorrows, finds a way through every gate. The moment came not dramatically at first, but almost accidentally. Siddhartha, now 29 years old, asked his charioteer Channa to take him beyond the palace grounds. He wanted to see the city of Kapilavastu, to know his future subjects, to understand the world he was meant to rule. His father agreed, but ordered the streets cleaned, the sick and elderly hidden, only the young and healthy allowed on display. Another stage set, another illusion, yet someone always escapes the net. The first encounter was with an old man, bent and trembling, making his painful way with a stick. Siddhartha had never seen such a sight. "What has happened to this man?" he asked Channa, with genuine bewilderment. "Why is his body so changed? Why does he struggle so to move?" "This is old age, my lord," Channa replied quietly. "It comes to everyone who lives long enough." "Everyone?" The question hung in the air. "You mean to me as well?" "Yes, my lord, to all who are born." The prince rode back in silence, the music in his palace suddenly hollow. On the second journey, he saw a man ravaged by disease, covered in sores, shaking with fever, groaning with pain. Again, the question. Again, the terrible answer. Sickness comes to all. No palace wall can keep it out forever. No amount of wealth can guarantee protection. The third encounter was with a corpse being carried to cremation, the body wrapped in white cloth, mourners wailing behind it. Death itself, the final truth no luxury could delay forever. Siddhartha learned that everyone he loved, his wife, his newly born son Rahula, his father, himself, all were travelling toward that funeral pyre. Time was not infinite. This paradise was temporary. These three encounters with old age, sickness, and death are called the three messengers in Buddhist tradition. They shattered Siddhartha's carefully constructed world like a stone through glass. Everything he had taken as permanent revealed itself as fragile. Everything he had assumed was secure showed its hidden expiration date. The palace that had seemed like heaven became a waiting room for suffering. But there was a fourth encounter, and this one opened a door. Siddhartha saw a wandering ascetic, a holy man who owned nothing but a robe and a bowl, yet whose face radiated something the prince had never seen in his palace of pleasures: peace. Deep, unshakable peace. Here was someone who had seen old age, sickness, and death, yet walked through the world with serenity. Here was someone who had found a way to face the fundamental facts of existence without despair. "Who is that?" Siddhartha asked. "A seeker, my lord, one who has left home in search of truth, seeking liberation from suffering." Liberation from suffering? The words ignited something in Siddhartha's mind like a spark in dry grass. If suffering was inevitable, could liberation from it also be possible? If death awaited everyone, could there be a way to face it without fear? If this whole existence was as impermanent as morning dew, was there something beyond impermanence to discover? The questions consumed him. He tried to continue his palace life, holding his newborn son Rahula, making love to Yasodhara, attending to royal duties. But he was a man awakening from a dream, and the dream could not hold him. The music sounded like distraction. The pleasures felt like drugs meant to dull awareness. The palace walls closed in like the walls of a prison. Night after night, he lay awake beside his sleeping wife, wrestling with the greatest question any human can face. What is this life for? If everything ends, if suffering is woven into the very fabric of existence, if even kingdoms crumble and palaces fall, what is worth doing? What is worth being? The conventional answers satisfied him not at all. Build a kingdom? It will fall. Ensure your dynasty? They will die. Gather wealth? You cannot take it with you. Find pleasure? It fades even as you grasp it. Even the spiritual traditions of his time seemed inadequate. The Vedic priests offered rituals and sacrifices to appease gods, but could rituals stop aging? The ascetics practiced extreme austerities to purify the soul, but did starving the body truly free the mind? Siddhartha wanted something more radical than temporary relief or postponement. He wanted to understand suffering at its root. He wanted to know if there was a way to be fully human, to face old age, sickness, and death with open eyes, and yet be free. Not free from the facts of existence, but free from the fear and grasping that turned those facts into torture. This was not a philosophical puzzle to solve with logic. This was an existential crisis that demanded total commitment. You cannot understand suffering by reading about it. You cannot achieve liberation by proxy. If the truth was to be found, Siddhartha would have to seek it himself with everything he had. And so the prince made a decision that would cost him everything he had been given and open a path for millions yet unborn. He would leave. He would abandon palace, throne, wife, and child. He would step through the gates into homelessness and uncertainty. He would become that figure he had seen on his fourth journey, a seeker, walking the razor's edge between worlds, searching for the liberation that transcended all conditions. His father begged him to stay. His wife wept. His clan needed him. But Siddhartha had seen through the illusion. He understood now that his father's love, expressed through golden cages, was itself a form of suffering. The suffering of clinging, of trying to hold back time, of denying truth to maintain comfort. He understood that to truly help those he loved, he would need to find answers his palaces could never contain. The night chosen for departure was moonless, dark as the questions in his heart. Tradition tells us that Siddhartha went one last time to his wife's chambers. Yasodhara lay sleeping, their infant son Rahula cradled in her arms. The prince stood in the doorway, drinking in the sight. To wake her would mean explanations, tears, attempts to dissuade him. The pull of love and duty might prove too strong. So he turned away, carrying an image that would haunt him through every hardship to come. He found Channa, his faithful charioteer, and commanded him to saddle Kanthaka, his white horse. The servants were drugged into deep sleep by supernatural intervention, the legends say, though perhaps it was simply the early hour and Siddhartha's careful planning. Through the silent palace they moved, through gates that opened as if by magic, across the grounds where he had played as a child. At the edge of Sakya territory, Siddhartha dismounted. He drew his sword, the sword he had wielded in tournaments, the sword meant to defend his kingdom, and with it he cut off his hair, that symbol of royal status. He removed his fine clothes and gave them to Channa, taking in exchange a simple robe. The charioteer wept, holding the horse's bridle, begging the prince to reconsider. "Return to the palace," Siddhartha said gently but firmly. "Tell my father I have not left because I lack love, but because I love too much to pretend. Tell Yasodhara I will return when I have found what I seek, or I will not return at all. Tell them I do this not for myself alone, but for all who suffer." Channa rode back as dawn broke, leading the riderless horse, carrying silk robes and royal ornaments. Behind him, walking away into the forest, went a solitary figure in rough cloth. Prince Siddhartha was gone. In his place walked a homeless wanderer, with nothing but determination and the most dangerous question ever asked. Is liberation possible? The great renunciation was complete. The gates of paradise had closed behind him. Ahead lay uncertainty, hardship, and a journey to the very edge of what human consciousness could endure. But also ahead, though he could not know it yet, lay a discovery that would echo across 25 centuries, touching billions of lives, transforming how humans understood the nature of mind, suffering, and freedom. The young man walking into the forest that morning was still Siddhartha, still carrying all his questions and fears. He would not become the Buddha, the awakened one, for another 6 years. Those years would break him and remake him. They would strip away everything he thought he knew. They would test his commitment beyond all reasonable limits. But that is a story for the next turning of the wheel, for the next stage of a journey that would end beneath a tree, on a night when the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath. waiting to see if a human being could finally wake up. The forests of ancient India were not empty wilderness. They were alive with seekers, men who had walked away from ordinary life in pursuit of extraordinary understanding. Some sat motionless beneath trees for months at a time. Others wandered perpetually, owning nothing, dependent on whatever villagers might offer. Still others gathered in small communities around charismatic teachers, forming the world's first universities of consciousness. Into this world of spiritual experimentation walked the former Prince Siddhartha, and he brought with him the same intensity he had once applied to archery and swordsmanship. If liberation existed, he would find it. If truth could be known, he would know it. The determination that had made him excel in every palace competition now focused on a single, consuming goal: the complete understanding of suffering and its cessation. But where to begin? The forest was full of methods, full of competing philosophies, full of teachers claiming ultimate knowledge. Some taught that the soul was eternal and merely needed to be purified. Others denied the soul entirely, claiming only atoms and void existed. Some said liberation came through ritual and sacrifice. Others insisted on extreme asceticism. The marketplace of spiritual ideas was as chaotic as any merchant's bazaar. Siddhartha did what any intelligent seeker would do. He found the best teachers and learned what they had to teach. His first teacher was Alara Kalama, a meditation master renowned throughout the region. Alara taught a sophisticated technique of mental concentration that could lead to what he called the sphere of nothingness, a state of consciousness so refined that all ordinary perception dissolved into pure, undifferentiated awareness. It was a remarkable achievement, representing the highest development of meditation practice in that era. Siddhartha mastered it in weeks. Imagine Alara's astonishment. Students typically spent years developing the mental discipline required to reach such states, but Siddhartha, with the focus he had once applied to hitting distant targets, penetrated directly to the heart of the practice. He could enter the sphere of nothingness at will, remaining in that exalted state for hours, experiencing a peace beyond anything his palaces had offered. Alara recognized an equal. "Stay with me," he said. "Teach alongside me. We will lead this community together." But Siddhartha, even in the afterglow of profound meditative peace, recognized something crucial. When he emerged from meditation, the fundamental questions remained. Old age, sickness, and death still awaited. The peace was temporary, conditional, dependent on maintaining a specific mental state. This was not liberation. This was a very refined form of escape. He thanked Alara and moved on. His second teacher was Uddaka Ramaputta, who taught an even subtler state called the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception, the absolute edge of what concentrated mind could achieve. It was a state so refined that consciousness barely flickered, hovering in a twilight zone between existence and non-existence. Again, Siddhartha mastered the teaching quickly. Again, the teacher offered partnership, and again, Siddhartha recognized the limitation. These were extraordinary achievements of mental training, worthy of respect and study. They demonstrated that consciousness was far more malleable than most people imagined, but they did not answer the fundamental question: what is the nature of suffering, and how can one be truly free? The techniques he had learned were like climbing to the highest peaks of a mountain range, only to realize that the mountain itself stands on uncertain ground. You could reach spectacular heights of meditative accomplishment and still not understand the foundation of existence. Siddhartha needed a different approach. If the highest meditation masters could not provide the answer, perhaps the answer lay in a more radical direction. Perhaps liberation required not the refinement of consciousness, but the complete subjugation of the body. Perhaps the physical self, with all its desires and demands, was the obstacle. This was the philosophy of the ascetics, and it was taken to extremes that seem almost incomprehensible today. Throughout ancient India, holy men were testing the limits of what a human body could endure. They stood on one leg for years until the other withered. They stared at the sun until they went blind. They ate so little that their bodies became skeletal. They slept on beds of thorns. They held their arms above their heads until the muscles atrophied and the arms could not be lowered again. The theory was simple. The body is prison, desire is the jailer, and extreme austerity is the key to escape. Starve the body, and you starve desire. Torture the flesh, and you transcend the flesh. Make yourself so uncomfortable that you develop complete equanimity toward physical sensation. Siddhartha threw himself into this practice with the same wholehearted commitment he had brought to his meditation training. But this time, he would not study under a teacher. This time, he would go further than anyone had gone before. If asceticism was the path, he would walk it to its ultimate conclusion. 5 other ascetics, already practicing severe austerities near the village of Uruvela, watched this newcomer with growing amazement. His determination seemed superhuman. While they took minimal food, he took less. While they sat in meditation through heat and cold, he sat longer. While they accepted the basics of survival, he pushed toward the edge of death itself. The descriptions that come down to us are difficult to hear. Siddhartha reduced his food intake to a single grain of rice per day. His body, once strong and beautiful from palace life, became a skeleton wrapped in skin. His ribs protruded like the beams of a ruined house. His eyes sank deep into their sockets. His skin turned dark and withered. When he touched his stomach, he could feel his spine through his body, so little flesh remained between. He sat in meditation for days without moving, even as insects crawled across his skin and birds nested in his hair, mistaking him for a corpse. Monsoon rains soaked him. The blazing Indian sun burned him. He did not seek shelter. He did not adjust his position. He was like a statue, barely breathing, testing whether consciousness could be separated from physical sensation through sheer force of will. The 5 ascetics who watched him began to think, surely this man will achieve what no one else has achieved. If anyone can reach liberation through austerity, it will be Siddhartha. They became his disciples in advance, waiting to learn from one who surpassed them all. 6 years passed in this manner. 6 years of systematic self-torture, 6 years of pushing human endurance beyond reasonable limits. And what did Siddhartha discover? He discovered that extreme asceticism was another dead end. The insight came gradually, built from careful observation even in the midst of suffering. Yes, severe austerity developed willpower. Yes, it created equanimity toward physical discomfort. Yes, it demonstrated that consciousness could remain clear even when the body was in distress. But, and this was crucial, it did not lead to understanding. The mind weakened along with the body. Thinking became clouded. Insight became elusive. The fundamental questions about suffering remained unanswered. Siddhartha realized something that seems obvious in retrospect, but was revolutionary in his context. The body is not the enemy. Desire is not the fundamental problem. Trying to achieve liberation through destroying the physical self is like trying to play a musical instrument with broken strings. You need the instrument in working condition to make music. You need the body-mind in healthy condition to achieve genuine understanding. This realization was itself a kind of awakening, not the final one, but a necessary prerequisite. Siddhartha understood that he had been swinging between extremes, the extreme of indulgence in his palace life, and now the extreme of self-mortification in the forest. Both extremes missed the point. Both were forms of obsession with the physical self, just in opposite directions. What if liberation lay not in either extreme, but in a middle way? What if the path required balance rather than violence toward oneself? It was a dangerous moment. After 6 years of severe practice, after becoming a legend among ascetics, to suddenly change course required tremendous courage. It meant admitting that 6 years had been, in a sense, wasted, or at least that they had taught him primarily what not to do. It meant disappointing his disciples. It meant abandoning the identity he had constructed as the most extreme ascetic of all. But Siddhartha had not come to the forest to maintain an identity or impress disciples. He had come to find truth, and truth, he now understood, required a functional body-mind, not a destroyed one. One morning, he stood up from his meditation, and walked toward the Neranjara river. His legs barely supported him. His body was so weakened that he nearly drowned trying to bathe. But he emerged from the water determined to restore his health, to give himself the physical and mental tools necessary for the final push toward understanding. A village girl named Sujata, coming to make offerings at a sacred tree near the river, saw this emaciated ascetic and was moved by compassion. She had prepared a special offering, rice cooked with milk, a nourishing meal. She offered it to Siddhartha with reverence, not knowing she was providing fuel for the most important night in spiritual history. Siddhartha accepted the food. He ate slowly, mindfully, feeling strength return to his body. It was, in its way, a sacrament, a recognition that the body deserved care, that nourishment was not sin, that the middle way began with treating oneself with the same compassion one would offer others. His 5 disciples witnessed this with horror. Their hero was falling from grace. The man who had exceeded them all in austerity was now eating like an ordinary person, abandoning the path they thought led to liberation. In their eyes, he had failed. Disappointed and disgusted, they left him, walking away to practice their austerities elsewhere. Siddhartha watched them go without protest. He could not explain what he had learned because he had not yet fully understood it himself. He knew only that extreme asceticism was not the answer, just as extreme indulgence had not been the answer. He knew only that he needed to find a different approach entirely. But what approach? He had studied under the greatest meditation masters and learned they could not provide final liberation. He had pushed ascetic practice beyond where anyone else had gone and found only weakened body and clouded mind. The conventional religious answers of his time, the sacrifices, the rituals, the prayers to gods he had already seen through during his palace education. The materialist philosophers who denied any meaning beyond physical existence offered no solution to suffering, only resignation to it. Siddhartha was in a unique position in human history. He had exhausted the known spiritual methods of his era. He had tested the extreme possibilities of human consciousness and physical endurance. He had eliminated every false path with the thoroughness of a scientist. And he had arrived at a place where no map existed, where no teacher could guide him further. He was entirely alone with the question, and the question had become sharper, more focused through his years of practice. It was no longer a philosophical puzzle about suffering in general. It had become personal and immediate. What is happening right now in this mind-body process? What is the actual mechanism by which suffering arises? How does consciousness work? What is observing these experiences? These were not abstract questions. They were investigations to be conducted with the precision of a master craftsman examining a complex mechanism. Siddhartha had developed, through his years of practice, an extraordinary capacity for focused attention. He had learned to enter profound states of mental concentration. He had developed unflinching equanimity toward physical sensation. These were the tools. Now he needed to apply them not to escape experience, but to understand it completely. There was a tree near the village of Bodh Gaya, a species of fig tree that locals held sacred. It stood alone on the bank of the river, its branches spreading wide, its roots deep. Siddhartha, restored somewhat in strength from Sujata's offering, walked to this tree. He gathered grass and fashioned a cushion beneath its branches. And there, at what would become the most famous spot in Buddhist geography, he sat down with a vow that would determine his fate. He would not rise from this spot until he had penetrated the fundamental nature of existence. He would not stop until he understood suffering completely, its origin, its mechanism, its cessation. He would sit there until he achieved full awakening, or he would die in the attempt. It was not bravado. It was not drama. It was the simple determination of someone who had tried everything else and knew there was nowhere left to go but through. Either consciousness could understand itself completely, or it could not. Either liberation from suffering was possible, or it was not. Either this night would bring answers, or nothing would. The sun set over ancient India. Stars emerged in a sky unpolluted by cities. Insects sang in the darkness. The river flowed on as it had for millions of years, and beneath the tree a solitary figure arranged himself in meditation posture, crossed his legs, straightened his back, and turned his attention inward for what would become the longest and most consequential night any human had ever spent. The battle was about to begin. Not a battle with external enemies or supernatural demons, though legend would clothe it in such images, but a battle with every illusion, every false belief, every conditioned pattern that kept consciousness trapped in suffering, a battle with ignorance itself. Siddhartha had abandoned paradise to seek truth. He had spent 6 years eliminating false paths. He had restored his strength. He had developed every tool consciousness could forge. Now, beneath the spreading branches of what would become known as the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening, he would discover whether a human being could truly wake up. The full moon of May rose over Bodh Gaya in the year 528, before the Common Era, casting silver light through the leaves of the Bodhi tree. Beneath its branches sat a man on the threshold between two worlds, the world of suffering and confusion that all humans inhabit, and a realm of clarity that no one had yet reached. What happened that night has been told and retold for 25 centuries, each culture adding layers of mythology, each tradition emphasizing different aspects. But beneath the mythological embellishments lies something real, a transformation in human consciousness so profound that its ripples continue to spread across the world today. The early Buddhist texts describe this night as a battle, and they personify the obstacles to awakening as Mara, the Lord of Illusion, the embodiment of everything that keeps consciousness trapped. Whether you understand Mara as an external demon or as a metaphor for internal resistance matters less than understanding what the figure represents: the accumulated weight of ignorance, fear, desire, and delusion that prevents clear seeing. As Siddhartha settled into meditation, the assault began. First came fear. Mara's armies approached hideous, terrifying figures wielding weapons, breathing fire, creating chaos. They represented every terror the mind could conjure: the fear of death, the fear of annihilation, the fear of letting go of everything familiar, the fear that this entire quest was foolishness, that there was nothing beyond conventional existence to discover. But Siddhartha had spent 6 years developing equanimity. He had sat unmoved through storms and blazing heat. He had faced the slow dissolution of his own body through starvation. Fear, he understood, was just another sensation arising in consciousness. He watched it come. He watched it peak. He watched it subside. The armies of Mara could not touch him. Then came desire. Mara sent his 3 daughters, discontent, delight, and craving, to seduce the meditator. They appeared in forms of irresistible beauty, promising pleasure, offering everything the senses could want. They represented the seductive pull of sensation, the voice that whispers, "Why seek liberation when gratification is available? Why pursue understanding when pleasure beckons?" This was perhaps the subtler test. Fear is obvious and can be faced directly. But desire wears the mask of promise. It offers happiness, fulfillment, satisfaction. Yet Siddhartha had lived in palaces full of pleasure and discovered that satisfaction is always temporary, always giving way to new wanting. He had learned that chasing desire is like drinking salt water to quench thirst. Each drink increases the craving. He watched desire arise in his mind like waves in an ocean, and he remained the depths, unmoved. Then Mara tried another approach. Doubt. Who are you to seek awakening? The demon challenged. What gives you the right? Show your witnesses. Prove your qualification. What makes you think a human can achieve what you attempt? This attack struck at identity itself. Siddhartha had abandoned his identity as a prince. He had abandoned his identity as an ascetic. Now he was being challenged to prove some essential worthiness, some qualification that would justify his quest. It was the voice of inadequacy, of imposter syndrome, of the belief that liberation is only for special beings, not for someone like you. The traditional story tells us that Siddhartha responded by reaching down with his right hand and touching the earth itself. "The earth is my witness," he declared. He called upon the ground beneath him to testify to his countless lifetimes of preparation, his dedication through eons of existence, his unwavering commitment to understanding. Whether you interpret this literally or metaphorically, the gesture represents something profound, the recognition that consciousness is not separate from the universe, that every atom in your body was forged in ancient stars, that the question, "Who am I?" cannot be answered by pointing to some separate, isolated self. The earth itself, vast, patient, supporting everything, bore witness, because Siddhartha was not separate from it. With this gesture, Mara's final attack was defeated. The demon and his armies, his daughters and his doubts, vanished like morning mist. The battlefield cleared, and Siddhartha, the warrior who fought with awareness rather than weapons, turned his attention to the real work of the night. The texts describe what followed as the 3 watches of the night, 3 progressive stages of deepening insight that would culminate in complete awakening. In the first watch, the hours after sunset, Siddhartha turned his highly concentrated attention to the question of continuity across time. Using the one-pointed focus he had developed through years of practice, he began to remember his past lives, not in a vague, metaphorical sense, but with specific, detailed clarity. He remembered being born as various beings in various realms. He remembered lives as humans in different circumstances, different cultures, different eras. He remembered existences as animals, as celestial beings, as creatures in states of suffering. 1 life, then 10, then 100, then thousands. Each memory carried its emotional valence, the joys, the sorrows, the mistakes, the small victories. What was the point of this remembering? It was not mere curiosity about personal history. It was a direct investigation into the nature of continuity and identity. As he watched life after life arise in memory, Siddhartha saw that what we call self is not a fixed, unchanging entity but a process, a stream of consciousness that flows through different forms. Each life seemed solid and real while it was being lived. Each identity seemed permanent, yet each dissolved and gave way to the next. He saw the fundamental impermanence of all conditioned existence. Nothing remains. Everything arises and passes away. The prince in the palace, the ascetic in the forest, the various beings in various realms, all were temporary manifestations in an ongoing process. To cling to any identity as if it were permanent was to guarantee suffering, because nothing lasts. This was not intellectual knowledge. This was direct seeing, as clear as watching water flow in a stream. The first great illusion, the illusion of a permanent, unchanging self, began to crack. In the second watch, the middle hours of the night, Siddhartha's investigation deepened. He developed what the texts call the divine eye, the ability to see not just his own continuity but the arising and passing of all beings. Like a person standing on a mountaintop watching travelers on the roads below, he observed consciousness flowing through the realm of existence. He saw beings being born and dying, moving from one state to another based on their actions, their understanding, their karma. He saw how states of mind create corresponding experiences. Those whose minds were filled with hatred and violence moved toward suffering. Those whose minds cultivated kindness and wisdom moved toward peace, not as divine punishment or reward, but as natural consequence, the way planting seeds leads to corresponding plants. This was the second great insight. The law of cause and effect extends to consciousness itself. Actions have consequences. Mental states generate corresponding experiences. The universe is not random chaos, nor is it controlled by arbitrary gods. It operates according to comprehensible principles. Suffering is not punishment. It is the natural result of certain mental patterns and actions. Peace is not grace bestowed from outside. It is the natural result of different patterns and actions. But knowing cause and effect is not the same as being free from it. Siddhartha could see the mechanism, but he had not yet transcended it. The deepest question remained: is liberation possible? Can consciousness escape the wheel of cause and effect, or is it forever bound within it? In the third watch, the hours before dawn, Siddhartha turned his attention to the fundamental structure of experience itself. He began investigating the present moment with extraordinary precision, examining how suffering actually arises in consciousness. He observed how perception works. Contact between sense organ and sense object gives rise to consciousness of that object. A sound occurs. Consciousness of sound arises. An image appears. Consciousness of seeing arises. So far, this is neutral, just information arriving. But then craving enters. The mind reaches toward pleasant experiences, wanting them to continue. The mind recoils from unpleasant experiences, wanting them to end. This craving, this pushing and pulling, this grasping and rejecting, creates a sense of self as the one who wants, the one who suffers, the one who must control experience. And because everything changes, because pleasant experiences end and unpleasant ones arrive, this craving can never be satisfied. The self that craving creates is locked in perpetual conflict with reality. This is suffering, not the inevitable pain of existence, but the mental anguish created by wanting reality to be other than it is. Siddhartha saw the chain with crystal clarity. Ignorance leads to mental formations, which lead to consciousness taking rebirth, which leads to name and form, which leads to the 6 sense bases, which leads to contact, which leads to feeling, which leads to craving, which leads to clinging, which leads to becoming, which leads to birth, which leads to aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. This was the core formula, the central discovery. Suffering has a cause, and the cause is not some external force but an internal process of ignorance and craving. The wheel of suffering turns because consciousness does not understand its own nature, and therefore creates elaborate structures of self and other, desire and aversion, hope and fear. But if suffering has a cause, then removing the cause would end suffering. If the chain of dependent origination could be broken at any link, the whole structure would collapse. If ignorance could be replaced with clear seeing, if craving could be replaced with equanimity, then liberation would be possible. And in that moment of insight, something unprecedented in human history occurred. The chain broke. Ignorance, faced directly, dissolved. The illusion of a separate, permanent self was seen through completely. Craving, understood at its root, lost its power. The entire structure of suffering, built on misunderstanding and maintained by habitual patterns, collapsed like a house of cards. What remained was consciousness without delusion, awareness without grasping, peace without condition, not the temporary peace of meditative states that end when you open your eyes, but unshakable freedom that does not depend on circumstances. The text described this moment in the most superlative language available. The earth shook, flowers rained from the sky, celestial beings rejoiced, the entire universe celebrated. Whether these are literal events or poetic expressions of the magnitude of what occurred, they point to a genuine transformation, the first human to fully wake up, to see clearly, to achieve what all seekers had been pursuing. Siddhartha was gone. In his place sat the Buddha, the awakened one. As dawn broke over the Naranjara river, light spreading across the land, the Buddha opened his eyes and looked upon the world with a gaze that had never before existed in human form. He saw the same trees, the same river, the same morning, but he saw them free from the distorting lens of craving and ignorance. He saw the interconnection of all things. He saw the process of existence without the illusion of separate, permanent entities. He saw suffering and its cessation as clearly as one sees the coming and going of breath. For 7 days, the texts tell us, the Buddha remained near the Bodhi tree, simply basking in the freedom he had achieved. He was like a man who had carried an enormous weight his entire life, and only now realized he could put it down. The burden of self, the burden of craving, the burden of future and past, all released. What remained was simple presence, profound peace, unshakable clarity. He moved from spot to spot around the tree, experiencing his new state from different perspectives. He walked back and forth in meditative pacing, integrating what he had discovered. He stood gazing at the tree under which awakening had occurred, his eyes unblinking in gratitude and wonder. He sat in a beautiful pavilion, created by the King of Serpents who, legend says, protected him from a sudden storm. But even in this state of profound peace, a question arose. It was not his question anymore. There was no longer a self with personal questions. But the situation posed a question nonetheless. What happens now? Should this discovery be shared? Or should the Buddha simply enter final nirvana immediately, passing from existence like a flame going out when fuel is exhausted? The teaching was subtle. The path was difficult. It went against every habit of the untrained mind. People were embedded in sensual pleasure, delighting in becoming, taking joy in existence exactly as it was. How could they understand teachings that pointed toward the relinquishment of craving, the seeing through of self, the cessation of becoming? The Buddha contemplated teaching and found the prospect daunting, not from fear — fear had been transcended — but from a clear assessment of the situation. The vast majority of beings were so covered in dust, so obscured by ignorance, that they could not see even if shown. Teaching them would be exhausting and fruitless, like trying to empty an ocean with a cup. But then and here the text introduced Brahma Sahampati, the highest god of the Indian cosmology. Though we can understand this as the Buddha's own deepest compassion speaking, another perspective arose. Yes, most beings were covered in dust, but there were some with only a little dust in their eyes. For them, hearing the teaching could make all the difference. They were like travelers lost in a forest who need only a finger pointing toward the path. For their sake, for the few who could understand, should not the teaching be offered? The Buddha, with his newly perfected wisdom, surveyed the world, and he saw beings at different levels of development, different capacities for understanding. He saw some who would indeed comprehend quickly, and he saw that offering the teaching to those few would create ripples that could spread far beyond what he could immediately see. His compassion no longer the limited compassion of a separate self trying to help others, but the natural overflow of awakened consciousness answered the question. He would teach. He would spend whatever years remained explaining what he had discovered, offering the path to anyone capable of walking it. But to whom should he teach first? The meditation masters Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta would have understood quickly being already highly developed, but both, the Buddha's newly awakened consciousness revealed, had died recently. They were beyond his teaching now, in whatever realm their karma had led them. Then the Buddha thought of his 5 former companions, the ascetics who had been so disappointed when he abandoned extreme austerity. They had witnessed his dedication. They had the determination to practice seriously. They were ready for teaching, even if they did not know it yet. Through his highly developed mental clarity, the Buddha perceived that the 5 ascetics were at Deer Park near Sarnath, several days' journey away. And so he rose from his seat beneath the Bodhi tree, taking one last look at the place where humanity had fundamentally changed, and began walking. He walked not as a prince or an ascetic, but as something entirely new, a human being who had solved the riddle of existence and was going forth to share the solution. His gait was measured and serene. His gaze was steady and clear. He had conquered not kingdoms but ignorance itself. He had won not wealth but something beyond all worldly treasures, freedom from suffering. The night of awakening was over. The age of the teaching was about to begin, and in a deer park near an ancient city, 5 skeptical ascetics were about to encounter a truth that would transform them, and through them, transform the world. The road from Bodh Gaya to Sarnath stretched across the Indian countryside, through villages and forests, past fields where farmers worked, and rivers where travellers stopped to rest. Along this road walked a figure who appeared ordinary, a homeless wanderer in simple robes, yet who carried within him the most extraordinary discovery in human history. People who encountered the Buddha during this journey sensed something different about him. His demeanour radiated a peace that was palpable. His movements possessed an effortless grace. One wandering ascetic named Upaka stopped him on the road, struck by the Buddha's luminous appearance. "Friend, your senses seem clear, your complexion pure and bright," Upaka said. "Under whom have you gone forth? Who is your teacher? Whose doctrine do you profess?" The Buddha's answer was simple and profound. "I have no teacher. No one is equal to me. I am the awakened one in this world. I am the unsurpassed teacher. I alone am perfectly enlightened. I have attained peace. I have attained nirvana." This was not arrogance. It was simply accurate description. He had achieved what no one else had achieved. He had understood what no one else had understood. But Upaka, like most people encountering claims of ultimate attainment, responded with skepticism. "May it be so, friend," he said, shaking his head, and took a different path. This moment foreshadowed a challenge the Buddha would face throughout his teaching career. How do you communicate the incommunicable? How do you describe awakening to those still asleep? How do you prove insight to those who have not yet seen? The Buddha did not chase after Upaka or try to convince him. He simply continued walking toward Deer Park, where his former companions waited. When the 5 ascetics saw their old colleague approaching, they made a pact among themselves. "Here comes the ascetic Gotama, who gave up striving and returned to luxury," they said. "We should not bow to him, or rise to greet him, or take his robe and bowl, but we can prepare a seat if he wishes to sit." Yet, as the Buddha drew near, their resolution crumbled. Despite themselves, they found themselves standing, bowing, preparing a seat, offering water to wash his feet. Something in his presence commanded respect beyond their conscious control. They still addressed him as friend Gotama, maintaining their skepticism, but their bodies had already recognized what their minds had not yet grasped. The Buddha smiled at their confusion. "Do not address me as friend," he said gently. "I am the awakened one, the perfectly enlightened Buddha. I have found the deathless. I will teach you. Practicing as I instruct, you will soon realize the supreme goal of the spiritual life." The 5 ascetics remained doubtful. They knew this man. They had watched him for years. They had seen him abandon the ascetic path. "Friend Gotama," they argued, You did not attain enlightenment through those severe practices. How could you attain it now by returning to comfort? 3 times the Buddha declared his awakening. 3 times they expressed doubt. Finally, he asked them a simple question. Have you ever known me to speak like this before? They fell silent. It was true something fundamental had changed. The tone of absolute certainty, the radiance of being, the palpable peace, these were not the qualities of someone pretending or deluded. Whatever had happened beneath the Bodhi tree had transformed their former companion into something unprecedented. Then listen, the Buddha said. I have found the deathless. I will teach you. And there, in Deer Park at Sarnath, as the evening sun cast long shadows and deer grazed peacefully nearby, Buddha gave his first sermon, what would become known as the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the discourse on setting the wheel of Dharma in motion. He began by describing the 2 extremes he had explored and found wanting, the extreme of sensual indulgence and the extreme of self-mortification. Both were dead ends, he explained. Both missed the essential point. Between them lay a middle way, not a tepid compromise, but a precise path that avoided both pitfalls while incorporating the valuable elements of each. This middle way, the Buddha taught, consisted of 8 factors: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Not rules imposed from outside, but natural expressions of clear understanding. Not commandments to follow out of fear, but wisdom that naturally manifests when ignorance clears. Then he articulated what would become the foundation of all Buddhist teaching, the 4 Noble Truths. The first truth: suffering exists, not as pessimism or complaint, but as honest assessment. Life contains suffering in the obvious forms of pain, sickness, aging, and death, but also in the subtle forms of dissatisfaction, anxiety, and the pervasive sense that something is not quite right. Even pleasure contains suffering because pleasure is temporary, and trying to hold on to it creates stress. This was not a judgment but an observation, as neutral as noting that fire is hot. The second truth: suffering has a cause. It does not arise randomly or from divine punishment. It arises from craving the thirst that drives consciousness from one experience to another, always seeking satisfaction, always finding temporary relief that quickly gives way to new wanting. Craving for sensual pleasure, craving for existence itself, even craving for non-existence. This endless thirst, rooted in ignorance about the true nature of reality, perpetuates the cycle of suffering. The third truth: suffering can cease. This was the revolutionary claim, the reason the teaching mattered. Because suffering has a cause, removing that cause ends suffering. Liberation is not a distant heaven or a reward for good behavior. It is the natural result of uprooting craving and the ignorance that supports it. The Buddha knew this truth not as theory but as lived experience. He had extinguished craving in himself and found freedom. The fourth truth: there is a path leading to the cessation of suffering, the same 8-fold path he had just described. Not a quick fix or an easy answer, but a systematic training of ethics, meditation, and wisdom that gradually transforms consciousness. As the Buddha spoke, something remarkable occurred in the mind of Kondana, one of the 5 ascetics. The teaching penetrated. The truth became self-evident. Right there, listening to these simple but profound words, Kondana achieved what the texts call the stainless, pure vision of the Dharma. He saw directly that everything that has the nature to arise has the nature to cease. He understood impermanence not intellectually, but with the clarity of direct perception. Kondana has understood, the Buddha exclaimed with joy. Kondana has understood. From that moment, the ascetic would be known as Anna Kondana, Kondana, who understood. But understanding the teaching intellectually and achieving full awakening are different stages. Kondana had glimpsed the truth, but the work remained to fully realize it. Over the following days and weeks, the Buddha continued teaching the 5 ascetics, guiding them through progressive stages of practice and insight. He taught them about non-self, the radical insight that what we call I is not a fixed entity but a collection of constantly changing processes: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness. None of these constitutes a permanent self. They are like the parts of a chariot that together create the appearance of a solid thing, yet no single part is the chariot itself. One by one, through dedicated practice and the Buddha's skillful guidance, all 5 ascetics achieved full awakening. The world now contained 6 awakened beings instead of 1. The Sangha, the community of awakened practitioners, was born, but it did not remain at 6 for long. A wealthy young man named Yasa, troubled by the emptiness of his comfortable life, wandered to Deer Park one night and encountered the Buddha's teaching. He too awakened. Then his father came seeking him and heard the teaching. Then his mother and former wife. Then 54 of Yasa's friends from the merchant class. Within months, 60 fully awakened beings walked the earth. The Buddha gathered them and gave them their mission. Go forth, monks, for the welfare of the many, for the happiness of the many, out of compassion for the world. Teach the Dharma that is good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end. Proclaim the spiritual life both in its particulars and in its essence, completely perfect and pure. They dispersed in different directions, each becoming a teacher, each turning the wheel of Dharma in new territories. The exponential growth had begun, and the Buddha himself, now free to travel widely, began a 45-year teaching career that would touch every level of Indian society. His journey took him back toward Kapilavastu, back toward the kingdom he had abandoned 20 years earlier. News of his awakening and teaching had reached his homeland, creating both wonder and controversy. The prince who had disappeared into the forest had returned as something unimaginable, a fully awakened Buddha. King Suddhodana, now an old man, sent messengers to invite his son home. The first 9 delegations all encountered the Buddha's teaching, achieved awakening themselves, and joined the Sangha instead of returning. Finally, the 10th delegation succeeded in convincing the Buddha to visit Kapilavastu. Imagine this: homecoming. The prince who had left in secret, cutting off his hair and abandoning his responsibilities, now walked openly into the city, accompanied by hundreds of awakened disciples. He came not as a conquering hero or a returning heir, but as a homeless teacher who owned nothing, whose only gift was the Dharma itself. The Sakya clan, proud warriors accustomed to hierarchy and protocol, initially did not know how to respond. Should they bow to one of their own? The Buddha's father and relatives hesitated, uncertain whether family ties or spiritual attainment should take precedence. The Buddha, perceiving their confusion, performed what the texts call a miracle, rising into the air and displaying various supernatural powers. Whether understood literally or as metaphor for the profound impact of his presence, the message was clear. This was not simply the prince returned, but a being who had transcended ordinary human limitations. The Sakyas bowed. King Suddhodana bowed to his own son. The old distinctions of worldly rank dissolved before the recognition of genuine spiritual attainment. In the following days, the Buddha taught his family and clan. His father, initially resistant, eventually achieved awakening before his death. His aunt Mahapajapati, who had raised him after his mother's death, became a devoted follower. His son, Rahula, now a young man who had grown up without a father, was ordained as a monk. Most poignantly, his former wife Yasodhara, who had maintained her own spiritual practice during the years of his absence, received teachings that led to her awakening. The woman he had abandoned without explanation became one of his most accomplished disciples. The personal tragedy of their separation transformed into liberation for both. But perhaps the most consequential family conversion was that of Ananda, the Buddha's cousin. Ananda became the Buddha's personal attendant, remaining at his side for the last 25 years of his life. Ananda's perfect memory would preserve the Buddha's teachings, making him essential to the survival of the Dharma after the Buddha's death. His devoted service and eventual awakening exemplified how different temperaments could approach the path. As the Buddha's fame spread, conversions became increasingly dramatic. The murderous bandit Angulimala, who had killed 99 people and wore a garland of their fingers, encountered the Buddha on a forest road. The Buddha's fearless presence and teaching transformed the killer into a gentle monk who achieved full awakening. Stories like this demonstrated that no one was beyond redemption, no past too dark to prevent enlightenment. Two wandering philosophers, Sariputta and Moggallana, heard a simple verse from a monk explaining that all things arise from causes and cease when causes cease. Just this brief statement sparked their awakening to the first stage of enlightenment. They became the Buddha's chief disciples, excelling respectively in wisdom and supernatural powers. Their conversions brought with them their own students, 250 practitioners who swelled the Sangha's ranks. Kings became patrons. King Bimbisara of Magadha, one of the most powerful rulers of the age, offered his support and protection. He donated the Bamboo Grove Monastery, creating the first fixed residence for the wandering monks. King Pasenadi of Kosala also became a devoted supporter, his kingdom becoming a stronghold of Buddhist teaching. The wealthy merchant Anathapindika, moved by the Buddha's teaching, purchased an entire park from Prince Jeta at enormous cost. The price was set at covering the ground with gold coins and donated it to the Sangha. The Jetavana monastery became the Buddha's primary residence during the rainy season retreats, a place where he delivered many of his most important teachings. Women, too, found unprecedented opportunity in the Buddha's movement. When Mahapajapati requested permission to establish an order of nuns, the Buddha initially hesitated, not from misogyny, scholars suggest, but from practical concerns about how such a radical innovation would be received in a deeply patriarchal society. But Ananda advocated on the women's behalf, pointing out that women were equally capable of achieving awakening. The Buddha relented, establishing the Bhikkhuni Sangha, the order of nuns. Mahapajapati and 500 Sakya women were ordained, becoming the first female renunciants in the Buddhist tradition. This was revolutionary. In a society where women's spiritual capacity was often dismissed, the Buddha declared them fully capable of awakening. Though additional rules were imposed on the nuns' rules that would become controversial in later centuries, the mere existence of the order transformed possibilities for women's spiritual development. The teachings themselves grew more sophisticated as the Buddha responded to different audiences and questions. To scholars, he offered complex analyses of consciousness and causation. To ordinary householders, he gave practical ethics and the benefits of generosity. To monks and nuns, he provided detailed meditation instructions and philosophical frameworks. He taught dependent origination, the principle that all phenomena arise from conditions and cease when those conditions end. Nothing exists independently. Everything is interconnected. Self and world, subject and object, are not separate entities but mutually dependent processes. This insight, explored in depth, revealed the emptiness of inherent existence and the constructed nature of all phenomena. He taught the four foundations of mindfulness, contemplation of body, feelings, mental states, and mental objects. This systematic training in present moment awareness became the core meditation practice, gradually developing the clarity needed to see reality as it actually is, rather than through the distorting lens of habit and assumption. He taught loving-kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. the four boundless states that transform how consciousness relates to all beings, not as feel-good sentimentality, but as systematic practices that gradually dissolve the artificial boundaries between self and other. The teachings accumulated like a great library. The Buddha's extraordinary memory and teaching skill allowed him to tailor explanations to each student's capacity. He became famous for his use of questions, parables, and skillful means, teaching methods that led students to discover truth themselves, rather than merely accepting doctrines. Yet success bred challenges. Not everyone welcomed the Buddha's message. Competing teachers saw their students and patronage diminishing. Conservative religious authorities viewed the Buddha's rejection of caste hierarchy and Vedic authority as dangerous. Political intrigue swirled around any movement that attracted royal patronage. The Buddha's own cousin, Devadatta, ordained as a monk but consumed by jealousy, created the most serious internal threat. Devadatta wanted to lead the Sangha himself. He proposed stricter rules, attempting to position himself as more pure than the Buddha. When this failed, he tried assassination, hiring archers, then rolling a boulder down a mountain toward the Buddha, then releasing a mad elephant. All attempts failed. The archers, encountering the Buddha's presence, could not release their arrows. The boulder split and missed. The elephant, charging forward with killing intent, stopped and grew gentle when it reached the Buddha. Devadatta's schemes unraveled. He created a schism, drawing away some monks with promises of stricter practice, but most eventually returned. Devadatta died without achieving his aims, a cautionary tale about how ambition and jealousy poison even spiritual communities. Through all of this, the conversions and challenges, the growth and conflicts, the triumphs and setbacks, the Buddha remained centered. He did. He did not seek followers or build an empire. He simply offered teaching to those ready to hear it, trusting that truth would spread naturally, like ripples from a stone dropped in water. For 45 years, he walked the roads of northern India. Through monsoons and blazing heat, he traveled from village to village, city to city, monastery to monastery. He taught householders in the morning, monks in the afternoon, visitors in the evening. He accepted invitations from the wealthy and the poor alike. He sat with kings and outcasts, Brahmins and untouchables, philosophers and farmers. His daily routine became legendary in its simplicity and discipline. Rising early, he would meditate, then go on alms round, accepting whatever food was offered, rich or plain, delicious or bland, eating mindfully and moderately. After the meal, he would teach. In the afternoon, he would rest and meet individually with students. In the evening, more teaching. Late at night, after most had retired, he would sleep briefly only a few hours, then rise again to meditate before dawn. This routine continued year after year, decade after decade. The young prince who had abandoned paradise, the ascetic who had nearly starved himself, was now an old man, still teaching, still travelling, still pointing others toward awakening. His hair had turned white. His body, though still remarkably healthy, showed the signs of age, yet his clarity never wavered, his compassion never diminished. By his 80th year, the Buddha had trained thousands of fully awakened disciples. The Dharma had spread throughout the Gangetic plain. Monasteries dotted the landscape. The revolutionary idea that suffering could be understood and transcended had taken root in the consciousness of an entire region. But even the Buddha's body was subject to the law he taught. All conditioned things are impermanent. The time was approaching when the greatest teacher humanity had produced would demonstrate his final lesson: how to die with complete awareness, showing that even death is just another moment to be met with equanimity. The wheel of Dharma that had begun turning at Deer Park had gained unstoppable momentum. What happened next would determine whether the teaching would survive beyond its founder, whether the insights of one awakened individual could become a path accessible to all. The decades following the Buddha's awakening witnessed something unprecedented in human history: the systematic development of a complete science of mind, a technology of consciousness that could be taught, practiced, and replicated. What began beneath a tree with one person's insight evolved into a comprehensive tradition capable of guiding thousands toward liberation. Consider what had been created. In an age without printing presses or recording devices, without institutions of higher learning as we know them, a vast body of teaching was being preserved in the living memory of the Sangha. Every discourse the Buddha gave, every question he answered, every subtle point of doctrine he clarified, all of this was being memorized, word for word, by disciples who understood that preservation required perfect recall. The monastic community itself became a revolutionary institution. These were not merely places where people withdrew from the world, but laboratories of consciousness where systematic experiments in human transformation occurred daily. The monasteries that arose across northern India established patterns that would persist for millennia. The bamboo grove in Rajagaha, donated by King Bimbisara, became the prototype. Here, monks gathered during the rainy season, the 3-month period when travel became impossible due to flooding. These retreats, known as Vassa, transformed the Sangha from a wandering movement into something more stable and sustainable. During Vassa, intensive practice and study occurred. The Buddha would remain in residence, available for questions, giving systematic teachings that built upon one another. The daily rhythm of monastic life developed its own profound discipline. Before dawn, monks would rise for meditation. As morning light broke, they would take their bowls and walk in single file through nearby villages, receiving whatever food was offered. This alms round was not begging in the ordinary sense, it was a sacred exchange. Householders gained merit through generosity. Monks received sustenance while remaining humble and dependent on the community. Back at the monastery, the single meal of the day would be eaten before noon. Buddhist monks did not eat after midday, a practice that heightened awareness, simplified life, and demonstrated renunciation of comfort. The afternoon was reserved for study, meditation, and manual labor and maintaining the monastery. Evening brought more teaching and practice. Late night was for sleep, though many monks practiced through most of the night, rising again before dawn. This routine might sound austere, and it was, but it was also deeply liberating. Every aspect of life was simplified, every unnecessary complexity removed. Without possessions to maintain, without family obligations, without career ambitions, monks could direct all their energy toward the single goal of awakening. The simplicity itself was practice. Within this framework, a sophisticated code of conduct emerged. The Vinaya, the monastic discipline, eventually comprised over 200 rules for monks and even more for nuns. These were not arbitrary restrictions but guidelines discovered through experience, each rule arising in response to actual situations that had caused problems. Some rules addressed basic ethics: no killing, no stealing, no lying, no sexual activity. Others dealt with proper conduct: how to wear robes, how to eat mindfully, how to walk through a village, how to accept offerings. Still others concerned community harmony: procedures for resolving disputes, protocols for making decisions, guidelines for living together peacefully. The genius of the Vinaya was that it created conditions conducive to awakening. Each rule, properly understood, was a practice. Wearing robes in a particular way cultivated mindfulness. Eating one meal a day developed discipline. Rules about speech encouraged awareness of how words affect others. The entire code was a curriculum in conscious living. But the Buddha never intended rigid adherence to rules as an end in itself. When questioned about difficult cases, he often emphasized intention over literal compliance. The rules existed to serve liberation, not to become another form of bondage. This flexibility would prove essential as Buddhism spread to cultures with very different norms. Within the monastic community, specialization began to emerge. Some monks excelled in meditation, achieving extraordinary states of concentration. Others became scholars of the teaching, memorizing and explaining complex doctrines. Still others developed supernatural abilities, though the Buddha consistently warned against pride in such powers or using them for display. Sariputta, the Buddha's chief disciple in wisdom, exemplified the scholar-practitioner. His crystalline clarity in explaining doctrine made him an essential teacher. When students struggled to understand the Buddha's more challenging teachings, Sariputta could break them down, approach them from different angles, make them accessible without simplification. Moggallana, chief disciple in supernatural powers, demonstrated another dimension of practice. He could travel to different realms of existence, verify the results of karma, perceive beings invisible to ordinary sight. While the Buddha emphasized that such powers were side effects rather than goals, they demonstrated the radical plasticity of consciousness when developed systematically. Ananda, the Buddha's devoted attendant, showed that service itself could be a path. For 25 years he cared for the bard for Remesams Humantan Rementans. Buddha's needs arranging lodging, managing visitors, remembering every teaching. His perfect recall would prove invaluable after the Buddha's death. Yet Ananda's own awakening came late, only after the Buddha's passing, proving that even long association with an awakened teacher does not guarantee realization without personal effort. Among the women, Khema exemplified wisdom, becoming the foremost nun in insight. Upalavana demonstrated supernatural powers. Mahapajapati, the Buddha's aunt who founded the order of nuns, showed that older women could achieve awakening as readily as anyone. The Bhikkhuni Sangha grew to thousands, challenging conventional assumptions about women's spiritual capacity. The relationship between the monastic and lay communities evolved into a sophisticated symbiosis. Householders supported monks and nuns materially, receiving in return teaching, guidance, and a living example of the Dharma. This was not exploitation, both communities needed each other. Monks depended entirely on lay generosity for survival. Lay people depended on monks for preserving and transmitting the teaching. The Buddha gave extensive teachings specifically for householders, recognizing that not everyone could or should renounce worldly life. He taught about ethical livelihood, ways of earning a living that did not harm others. He taught about family relationships, how to be a good spouse and parent. He taught about wealth, explaining that money itself was not the problem but attachment to it was. He taught about friendship, community, and civic responsibility. This dual-track approach, intensive monastic practice, for those capable of it, ethical lay practice for everyone else, gave Buddhism remarkable adaptability. It could appeal to those seeking complete renunciation and those seeking better lives within the world. Both paths pointed ultimately toward the same goal, the cessation of suffering through the uprooting of ignorance and craving. Royal patronage accelerated the movement's growth, but also created new challenges. King Bimbisara of Magadha became one of the Buddha's earliest supporters, and his devotion brought both benefits and complications. Having a powerful king as patron meant protection, resources, and legitimacy. It also meant the Sangha became entangled in political affairs. When Bimbisara's son, Ajatasattu, staged a coup, imprisoning and eventually killing his father, the Buddha faced a moral dilemma. Ajatasattu had been influenced by Devadatta, the Buddha's treacherous cousin, in committing patricide. Should the Buddha refuse Ajatasattu's patronage? Should he publicly condemn the new king? The Buddha's response demonstrated sophisticated political awareness. He accepted Ajatasattu's offerings but taught him about karma and its consequences. He did not approve of the patricide but recognized that rejecting Ajatasattu entirely would accomplish nothing. Instead, he worked to reform the king's understanding, eventually leading Ajatasattu to genuine remorse and transformation. This pattern repeated with other rulers. The Buddha navigated between kingdoms at war, maintaining relationships with multiple kings simultaneously. When asked to take sides in conflicts, he typically refused, instead teaching about the futility of violence and the karmic consequences of warfare. His political neutrality, combined with genuine moral guidance, gave him influence that partisan alignment would have destroyed. The monastery donations from wealthy patrons created another challenge: how to maintain simplicity and renunciation amid increasing material support. The Jetavana monastery, purchased at enormous cost by Anathapindika, was magnificent. It included meditation halls, residential quarters, walking paths, gardens, and facilities for hundreds of monks. Some monks worried that such luxury contradicted the spirit of renunciation. The Buddha addressed this concern directly. Comfort itself was not the problem, he taught. Attachment to comfort was the problem. A monk could live in a palace or a forest, eat fine food or coarse. What mattered was the mind's relationship to these conditions. If one could remain unattached amid plenty, that demonstrated stronger practice than fleeing to the wilderness out of fear. This teaching of mental renunciation rather than mere physical austerity became central to Buddhist practice. The point was not to punish the body but to free the mind. External conditions mattered less than internal states. A monk clinging to his forest solitude was more trapped than one peacefully accepting whatever conditions arose. As the movement grew, doctrinal sophistication increased. The Buddha's teaching was not a single sermon repeated endlessly, but a vast, multifaceted system adapted to different audiences. Scholars later organized his teachings into what they called the Tripitaka, the 3 baskets of wisdom. The first basket contained the Vinaya, the monastic code, and its supporting commentary. The second contained the suttas, the actual discourses the Buddha gave, organized by length, theme, and occasion. The third contained the Abhidhamma, systematic philosophical and psychological analysis that emerged as practitioners tried to organize and categorize the Buddha's insights into coherent frameworks. Within the suttas, extraordinary diversity existed. Some discourses were brief and poetic, suitable for memorization and contemplation. Others were long and analytical, breaking down consciousness into its constituent parts. Some used stories and parables. Others employed rigorous logic. The Buddha adapted his teaching style to each audience. Peasants and philosophers, skeptics and believers, beginners and advanced practitioners all received teachings calibrated to their capacity. The philosophical depth was remarkable. The Buddha's analysis of consciousness identified 52 mental factors: greed, aversion, delusion, mindfulness, concentration, wisdom, and dozens of others, each of which could be strengthened or weakened through practice. He mapped meditative states with precision, describing 9 successive levels of concentration, each with distinct characteristics. He taught about karma with unprecedented sophistication. Actions had consequences, yes, but karma was not fate or predetermination. It was more like momentum. Past actions created tendencies, but present choice remained possible. Intention mattered more than outcome. The same action with different motivations generated different karmic results, and karma could be exhausted through wisdom, not merely by experiencing its effects. He revolutionized the concept of rebirth. Unlike the Hindu notion of an eternal soul transmigrating between bodies, the Buddha taught rebirth without a permanent self. What continued was a process, a stream of consciousness that carried karmic patterns forward. It was like a flame passed from one candle to another, continuity without identity, connection without permanence. These teachings were not meant as metaphysical speculation, but as practical guidance. Understanding impermanence, suffering, and non-self was not an intellectual exercise, but a transformative practice. The goal was not to believe correct doctrines, but to see reality directly, without the distorting filters of ignorance. The meditation practices themselves became increasingly refined. The Buddha taught two main approaches that complemented each other. Samatha, tranquility meditation, developed concentration through focusing on a single object. This created the stable, unified mind necessary for insight. Vipassana insight meditation investigated the nature of experience itself, observing how phenomena arose and passed away. Different practitioners emphasized different practices based on temperament. Those naturally calm might emphasize insight. Those naturally scattered might emphasize concentration. The Buddha, recognizing diversity in human psychology, never insisted on a single method, but offered various approaches, all pointing toward the same goal. Advanced practitioners reported extraordinary experiences. Some achieved what the Buddha called cessation, a temporary stopping of consciousness itself, beyond even the most refined meditative states. They would enter this condition deliberately, remaining for hours or days, emerging unchanged physically, but profoundly refreshed mentally. It was like consciousness taking a complete rest. Others developed the divine eye and divine ear, heightened perception that could see and hear beyond normal range. Some recalled past lives with clarity. Others perceived the karmic trajectories of beings. While the Buddha cautioned against attachment to such abilities, they demonstrated the extraordinary potential latent in trained consciousness. Yet the highest achievement remained simple and accessible, the ending of suffering. This required no supernatural powers, no elaborate philosophy, no years of study. It required only clear seeing. When ignorance ended, craving ended. When craving ended, suffering ended. The complexity of Buddhist doctrine existed to support this simple realization. By the Buddha's old age, the movement had achieved remarkable success. Thousands of awakened disciples, hundreds of monasteries, support from the most powerful kingdoms, a comprehensive teaching preserved in living memory, a functioning community capable of training new generations. Everything necessary for survival beyond the founder's lifetime seemed to be in place. But challenges remained. The very success created problems. Some monks became complacent, enjoying comfortable monastic life without serious practice. Some pursued scholarship at the expense of meditation. Some sought supernatural powers rather than liberation. The human tendency toward corruption affected even spiritual communities. More ominously, political conditions were deteriorating. The small kingdoms that had supported early Buddhism were being absorbed by larger empires. Warfare increased. Ajatasattu, despite his later remorse, had begun a process of conquest that would continue after the Buddha's death. The peaceful, prosperous conditions that had allowed Buddhism to flourish were ending. The Buddha, now in his late 70s, continued teaching with undiminished clarity but increasingly evident physical decline. His body, pushed to extremes in youth and maintained through decades of travel, was wearing out. Disciples whispered their concerns. How would the Sangha survive without him? Who would lead? How would disputes be resolved? Who could answer the difficult questions that continued to arise? The Buddha heard these concerns and addressed them directly. There would be no appointed successor, he declared. The Dharma itself must be the teacher. The Sangha must be self-governing, making decisions by consensus. Each practitioner must be an island unto themselves, relying on their own investigation rather than external authority. This was radical wisdom. Most religious movements depend on charismatic leaders and hierarchical authority. The Buddha was deliberately creating a decentralized structure that would survive precisely because it had no single point of failure. If the teaching was true, it would survive on its merits. If the practice worked, people would continue it. If the community was healthy, it would perpetuate itself. Yet even the Buddha could not entirely escape human psychology. The monks, despite his teachings on non-attachment, were attached to their teacher. Ananda, devoted after 25 years of service, could not contemplate life without the Buddha. The younger monks had known no other guide. The laypeople revered him almost as a god, though he repeatedly denied being anything more than a human who had awakened. As the Buddha entered his 80th year, everyone could see that the final teaching, he approached the teaching about how an awakened being faces death. This would be the ultimate test of everything he had taught. Could he remain equanimous even as his body failed? Could he show that liberation meant freedom from the fear of death itself? The stage was set for the final journey, the last lessons, and the moment when the greatest teacher humanity had produced would demonstrate that even death is just another phenomenon to be met with clear awareness and perfect peace. The rainy season of the Buddha's 80th year found him at Rajagaha, capital of Magadha, the kingdom that had been among his earliest and strongest supporters. But this year, something was different. The Buddha's body, which had carried him across thousands of miles over 45 years, was failing. Sharp pains troubled him, his energy diminished. Yet his mind remained luminous, clear as the day he awakened beneath the Bodhi tree. He gathered the monks and announced his intention to travel north, toward the small republic of the Mallas. It would be his final journey, though he did not say so explicitly. Those close to him, particularly Ananda, who had attended him for 25 years, sensed what was coming. The grief was already forming, like clouds gathering before a storm. The journey from Rajagaha toward Kusinara unfolded in stages, each stop marked by teachings that took on new poignancy given the context. At Nalanda, the Buddha spoke about the factors that lead to a community's decline or prosperity. A healthy sangha, he taught, meets regularly, gathers harmoniously, follows established guidelines, honors the elders, remains uncorrupted by craving, protects the wilderness where solitary practice occurs, and welcomes sincere practitioners. These were not abstract principles but final instructions. He was describing what the Sangha must do to survive without him. The monks listened with special attention, understanding that these teachings carried additional weight. At Patalagama, local leaders sought the Buddha's blessing for their new fortification, a strategic stronghold being built to protect against invasion. The Buddha complied, offering teachings on generosity and ethics. But privately, he told Ananda that this place would become one of the great cities of India, a prophecy that would prove accurate when Patalagama evolved into Pataliputra, capital of the Mauryan Empire. Yet even as he predicted the city's greatness, the Buddha knew it too would eventually fall. All conditioned things are impermanent, even empires crumble. Only the unconditioned nirvana itself remains beyond change. Crossing the Ganges, the Buddha and his attendants reached Vesali, where he had spent many rainy seasons. The courtesan Ambapali, one of the most famous women in India, invited the Buddha for a meal. The Lichavi princes, hearing of her invitation, rushed to invite him themselves, their chariots creating such a spectacle that the Buddha commented with gentle humor on their eagerness. But he kept his commitment to Ambapali, who served him with devotion and offered her mango grove to the Sangha. The episode demonstrated what the Buddha had taught throughout his career. Neither social status nor profession nor past disqualified anyone from encountering the Dharma. A courtesan's offering held equal value to a prince's donation. At Vesali, something momentous occurred. The Buddha climbed to the Kapala shrine, a sacred spot overlooking the city, and there he spoke to Ananda of a mysterious power he possessed, the ability to extend his lifespan through supernatural means. 3 times he hinted at this, waiting for Ananda to make the obvious request, "Lord, please remain for the benefit of many." But Ananda, his mind clouded by Mara, by whatever prevented clear thinking at crucial moments, did not ask. The opportunity passed. Later, the Buddha stated openly that he would die within 3 months. Ananda, realizing what he had failed to do, wept bitterly. The Buddha reassured him gently. Even if Ananda had asked, it would only have postponed the inevitable. All conditioned things must pass. Even the Buddha's body was subject to this law. This episode has puzzled commentators for centuries. Why would the Buddha hint rather than state clearly? Why make his continuation dependent on being asked? Perhaps it was a final teaching about impermanence, that even the presence of an awakened teacher is conditional, temporary, not to be taken for granted. Perhaps it demonstrated that clinging, even to a perfect guide, must eventually be released. Leaving Vesali, the Buddha paused at the city gates and turned for one last look. "This will be the final time I see Vesali," he told Ananda. The poignancy of the moment struck everyone present. The teacher who had walked these roads for decades was saying goodbye. The journey continued northward, but the Buddha's condition worsened. At the village of Pava, a blacksmith named Kunda offered a meal that has been controversial ever since. The texts call it Sukara Madhava, a term variously translated as pig's delight, a type of mushroom, soft pork, or food of pigs, perhaps truffles. Whatever the actual dish, it triggered severe illness. The Buddha, feeling violent dysentery beginning, instructed that no one else should eat the dish. He later sent a message to Kunda. The blacksmith should feel no remorse, for the meal he offered would generate great merit. The Buddha was teaching even in illness. Kunda's intention had been pure, offering the best he had. The karmic result depended on intention, not outcome. But the illness was serious. The Buddha, resting under a tree, told Ananda, "I am old now and full of years. My journey is drawing to a close. I am turning 80 years of age. Just as an old cart is held together with straps, so the Buddha's body is kept going with repairs." The metaphor was apt and deeply human. This was not a god departing, but a human body worn out from use. The Buddha made no pretense of transcending physical reality. Awakening liberated the mind from suffering, but did not exempt the body from aging, sickness, and death. The teaching was embodied in every painful step. Between Pava and Kusinara, the Buddha had to stop frequently to rest. At one point, he asked Ananda to spread his robe by the roadside so he could lie down. Ananda, seeing his teacher's weakness, wept openly. The Buddha, perceiving this, called him close. "Enough, Ananda. Do not grieve, do not lament. Have I not told you that all things dear and pleasant to us must suffer change and separation? How could it be possible that what is born, exists, is composite, and subject to decay, should not pass away? That is impossible. For a long time, Ananda, you have been in the Buddha's presence, showing loving kindness in act, word, and thought, beneficially, happily, wholeheartedly, and without measure. You have done well, Ananda. Keep trying, and soon you too will be free from all defilements." It was characteristic of the Buddha that even in extremis he offered encouragement. Even dying, he taught. Ananda's grief was natural, human, understandable, and also something to be observed, understood, and eventually transcended. Not denied, but seen clearly for what it was, another manifestation of attachment, another form of clinging that created suffering. The Buddha asked for water from a nearby stream. Ananda initially protested 500 carts had just passed through, muddying the water, but the Buddha insisted, and by the time Ananda reached the stream, it had cleared miraculously. He brought back pure water, marveling at the wonder even in such simple things. A young noble named Pukusa encountered the Buddha, resting by the road, and offered 2 golden-coloured robes. The Buddha accepted one for himself and one for Ananda. When Ananda draped the robe on the Buddha's body, the fabric seemed dull by comparison to the Buddha's. Skin itself radiated such light. There are 2 occasions. The the Buddha explained. When a Buddha's body becomes especially radiant, the night of awakening and the night of final passing into nirvana, the end was near. They reached the small town of Kusinara, unremarkable except that it would become one of Buddhism's most sacred sites. The Buddha asked Ananda to prepare a couch between two sal trees in a grove. The positioning was specific, his head to the north, lying on his right side in what would become known as the lion's posture. As he lay down, the sal trees burst into unseasonable bloom. Flowers fell like rain, covering the Buddha's body. Celestial music sounded in the air, or so the texts report. Whether literal or poetic, these images conveyed that something momentous was occurring. The greatest teacher was departing. Word spread quickly through Kusinara. People came in crowds, monks, nuns, lay people, even wandering ascetics from other traditions. Many wept openly. The Buddha, perceiving their grief, offered teaching. Do not say the Buddha is leaving you. The teaching and discipline I have proclaimed will be your teacher after I am gone. Follow the Dharma. Let it be your light. A wandering ascetic named Subhadra arrived, insisting on asking the Buddha questions. Despite Ananda's attempts to turn him away, it was late. The Buddha was dying. Surely questions could wait. But the Buddha overheard and invited Subhadra forward. Even on his deathbed, he would not turn away a sincere seeker. The conversation was brief but profound. Subhadra asked about other teachers, whether their paths led to awakening. The Buddha gave a pragmatic answer. Whatever teaching includes the noble eightfold path leads to awakening. Where that path is absent, neither stream enterers nor once returners nor non-returners nor arhats are found. The teaching itself, not the teacher's reputation, determines efficacy. Subhadra, hearing this clear explanation, immediately understood. He asked for ordination, and the Buddha granted it. Subhadra became the Buddha's last personal disciple, achieving full awakening before his teacher died, a final demonstration that the teaching could work quickly when it encountered a prepared mind. The Buddha then addressed the assembly one last time. Perhaps there is doubt or uncertainty in someone regarding the Buddha, the Dharma, or the Sangha, or about the path and practice. Ask now. Do not later regret thinking, the teacher was there before us, yet we failed to ask. 3 times he made this offer. 3 times, silence. No one had questions, not because everything was understood, but because nothing could be said. What questions could you ask someone departing toward the unformed, the unconditioned, the deathless? Words failed. Only silence remained adequate. Then perhaps out of respect you do not ask, the Buddha continued. Let one friend inform another. Still silence. Finally, Ananda spoke. It is wonderful. It is marvelous. I have confidence that in this assembly not one monk has doubt or uncertainty regarding the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, or the path and practice. You speak from confidence, Ananda, the Buddha replied gently. But I know this with certainty. In this assembly of monks, even the least has stream entry. Each is no longer subject to perdition, assured of awakening. These were his final words of reassurance. The path worked. The teaching was effective. Those who practiced sincerely would succeed. Nothing more needed to be said. Then came the final teaching, the last words the Buddha would speak to the world. Behold, monks, this is my last advice to you. All conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive with diligence. Vyadhamma sankhara apamadena sampadetha. All component things must pass away. Work out your salvation with diligence. It was perfect, a complete teaching in 2 sentences. Recognition of impermanence. Call to effort. Not pessimism, but realism. Not passivity, but engaged practice. Everything he had taught for 45 years distilled into this final instruction. The Buddha then entered into meditation, He passed through the successive stages of concentration he had mastered and taught, first jhana, second, third, fourth. Then beyond form entirely, infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothingness, neither perception nor non-perception. Then beyond even that, into cessation itself. He emerged briefly, descended back through the stages, then ascended again, up and down through the levels of consciousness like a musician playing scales one final time, demonstrating mastery even in departure. Finally, he entered the fourth jhana, and from there passed directly into parinirvana, complete nirvana, the final cessation, with no remainder, the ending of all conditioned existence. The earth shook. Thunder rolled through clear sky. The sal trees released all their blossoms at once. Those present reported that the very air seemed to hold its breath, then sigh. It was shortly before midnight. The full moon of May illuminated the grove. Between the two sal trees lay the body of Siddhartha Gautama, the prince who had abandoned paradise, the ascetic who had transcended extremes, the Buddha who had awakened and taught for 45 years. The body remained, still radiating peace, but the consciousness that had animated it, that had achieved what no human had achieved before, had gone beyond all possible description. Ananda broke down completely, sobbing against a tree. The younger monks wailed. Even the malice of Kusinara, who had barely known this visitor to their obscure town, grieved as if they had lost their own father. But the senior monks, those who had achieved awakening themselves, remained composed. They understood what the Buddha had taught. This was exactly what should happen. All conditioned things pass away. The body that was born 80 years ago had fulfilled its purpose and dissolved. The Buddha had not died, he had simply stopped maintaining the conditions for existence. For 7 days, the body lay in state, while people came to pay respects. Then, according to custom, it was cremated with the honours due a universal monarch: sandalwood, perfumes, cloth of gold. As the funeral pyre burned, witnesses reported that the flames consumed everything except the relics, small bone fragments that remained intact. These relics would become the centre of devotion. 8 kingdoms sent representatives claiming the right to enshrine portions. A Brahmin named Drona arbitrated, dividing the relics into 8 equal portions. Each kingdom built a stupa, a memorial mound to house their share. The urn that held the relics and even the ashes from the cremation were also enshrined. At these stupas, Buddhists for centuries to come would gather to remember their teacher, to renew their commitment to the path, to touch something tangible that connected them to the man who had awakened. The relics were not worshipped as having supernatural power. The Buddha had been clear that he was merely human. But they served as reminders, as inspiration, as focal points for practice. The parinirvana was simultaneously the greatest loss and the greatest teaching the Sangha had yet experienced. The loss was obvious and devastating. Their guide, their teacher, their living example had departed. Never again would someone be able to approach the Buddha with questions. Never again would his presence clarify doubts simply by proximity. But the teaching was equally profound. Nothing lasts. Even the Buddha, perfect in wisdom and compassion, was subject to death. Even the most precious relationship must end. Even the most profound teaching must eventually be carried forward by students, not teachers. Impermanence was not just doctrine to be believed, but reality to be lived. In death, the Buddha demonstrated everything he had taught about death. He faced it with complete awareness and equanimity. He made no attempt to avoid or postpone it beyond what was necessary to ensure the teaching's survival. He showed no fear, no resistance, no grasping at continued existence. He prepared his students, gave final instructions, and let go with perfect grace. His final teaching, all conditioned things are subject to decay, strive with diligence, became the ultimate koan. Yes, everything passes, including this teaching, including your own life. Therefore, what will you do? How will you live? What effort will you make? The answer was not to despair at impermanence, but to use the urgency it creates as fuel for practice. The time is short, the opportunity is precious, the path is clear. Walk it with diligence before your own body fails, before your own chance passes. The Buddha had lived this teaching perfectly. From the night he left the palace until the night he died, he strove with diligence. He discovered what needed to be discovered. He taught what needed to be taught. He created what needed to be created. And then, his work complete, he demonstrated the final letting go. The body between the sal trees was just a body, now elements returning to elements, form dissolving into formlessness. But the awakening that had occurred beneath the Bodhi tree, the insight that had been taught for 45 years, the path that had been walked and shown to others, these did not depend on continued existence. They were available to anyone, anywhere, at any time. The Buddha had achieved the impossible. He had made his own realization reproducible. He had found liberation, and then created a technology that allowed others to find it too. He had awakened and then awakened others to the possibility of awakening. Now came the crucial test. Would the teaching survive without its originator? Would the community hold together without its founder? Would the path remain clear without the pathfinder present to answer questions? The night in, Kusinara marked an ending. But endings, as the Buddha taught, are always also beginnings. The fire that consumed his body released smoke that rose into the dark sky, dispersing on the wind. And like that smoke, the teaching too would spread, carried by practitioners to places the Buddha had never imagined, transforming cultures he had never encountered, speaking to generations yet unborn. The smoke from the funeral pyre at Kusinara had barely dispersed when the Sangha faced its first crisis without the Buddha. Hundreds of monks gathered, grief-stricken and uncertain. Some wept uncontrollably. Others sat in stunned silence. A few, the fully awakened ones, remained composed, demonstrating the very equanimity the Buddha had taught. But even among the awakened there was concern. What happens now? One elderly monk named Subhada, not the final disciple but another by the same name, voiced what some were thinking. Enough of this grief, friends. We are well rid of that great ascetic. He was always bothering us with rules. This is proper, this is not proper. Now we can do as we like. It was a shocking statement, revealing that even after decades, some monks had not understood the teaching at all. They had joined the Sangha for wrong reasons, to escape from responsibility, free meals, social status, and had merely waited for freedom from discipline. The elder Mahakassapa, one of the Buddha's most accomplished disciples, heard this and understood immediately. The teaching was in danger. Without the Buddha's living presence to clarify, correct, and inspire, misunderstanding could spread like wildfire. False teachings could arise. The Dharma could be corrupted or lost entirely. Within weeks of the parinirvana, Mahakassapa convened what would become known as the First Buddhist Council. 500 fully awakened arhats gathered in a cave near Rajagaha, with King Ajatasattu providing support. Their mission was urgent and unprecedented, to preserve every word the Buddha had spoken, to agree on every rule he had established, to create a definitive record before memory faded or disputes arose. Ananda, despite his 25 years as the Buddha's attendant, had not yet achieved full awakening. The council nearly excluded him. But on the night before the gathering began, Ananda practiced with desperate intensity. Just before dawn, as he lowered his head to his pillow in exhaustion, his mind released its final clinging. A full awakening occurred in that instant, between standing and lying down. He arrived at the council as an arhat, his perfect memory now freed from any taint of attachment. The council's method was simple but exhaustive. Ananda recited the Buddha's teachings discourse after discourse, organized by length and theme. After each recitation, the assembly would confirm, "Yes, we heard this teaching. The words are correct. The context is accurate." Upali, expert in monastic discipline, recited the entire Vinaya, every rule, every case that prompted it, every exception and clarification. Again, the assembly confirmed. Imagine the achievement. Without writing, without recordings, without any technology beyond human memory, they preserved tens of thousands of words with perfect accuracy. Each discourse began with the formula, "Thus have I heard," at one time the Buddha was staying at, establishing context, location, and occasion. The repetition, the formulas, the rhythmic patterns, all were mnemonic devices that made oral preservation possible. This was not mere memorization like learning by rote. These monks had internalized the teachings through practice. They understood the doctrines experientially. Their awakened minds could recall not just words, but the living meaning behind them. The teaching was being preserved not as dead text, but as living transmission. The council lasted 7 months. When it concluded, the Sangha possessed something extraordinary, a complete, agreed-upon body of teaching that could be passed from generation to generation without corruption. Every monk would memorize portions. Senior monks would memorize everything. The teaching would live in human memory, protected by systematic review and collective agreement. But preservation was only the first challenge. The second was propagation. Buddhism was still confined largely to northern India, to the kingdoms and territories the Buddha had personally visited. If the teaching was to survive long-term, it needed to spread beyond this limited region. The opportunity came through tragedy. King Ashoka the Great ascended to the Mauryan throne around 230 years after the Buddha's death. His early reign was marked by violent conquest. The war against Kalinga was particularly brutal, over 100,000 killed, countless more enslaved or displaced. Standing on the battlefield, surveying the carnage he had created, Ashoka experienced something that changed history: revulsion, remorse, horror at what ambition and power had wrought. The texts describe his anguish at seeing the suffering war creates not just death but broken families, orphaned children, destroyed livelihoods, trauma that would echo through generations. Ashoka encountered Buddhist monks and their teaching. The message of non-violence, of compassion for all beings, of understanding suffering and its causes, struck him with the force of personal revelation. Here was a king who had achieved everything. Worldly success could offer vast empire, absolute power, unlimited wealth, and who discovered that none of it brought peace. The Buddha's teaching offered something his conquest never could: genuine transformation of consciousness. Ashoka's conversion was not superficial. He became perhaps the most devoted Buddhist monarch in history, using his imperial resources to spread the Dharma throughout Asia. He sent missionaries in all directions, to Sri Lanka, to Burma, to Central Asia, to the Greek kingdoms established by Alexander's successors. He erected pillars throughout his empire inscribed with Buddhist teachings and ethical principles. He established hospitals for humans and animals. He created parks and planted shade trees along roads. He restricted animal sacrifice and promoted vegetarianism. Most consequentially, he supported what would become the Third Buddhist Council, which produced an expanded canon and resolved doctrinal disputes. From this council, missions departed to regions far beyond India. Ashoka's son Mahinda and daughter Sanghamitta led the mission to Sri Lanka, carrying with them not just teachings but a sapling from the original Bodhi tree. That sapling, planted at Anuradhapura, still lives today, the oldest authenticated tree in the world, a living connection to the Buddha himself. Sri Lanka became Buddhism's fortress, preserving the Pali Canon, the complete collection of the Buddha's teachings through centuries when Buddhism declined or disappeared elsewhere. Theravada Buddhism, the way of the elders, maintained what practitioners considered the original teaching in its purest form. But Buddhism was also evolving, adapting, branching into new schools as it encountered different cultures. The development of Mahayana Buddhism, the Great Vehicle, represented one of the most significant transformations. Arising several centuries after the Buddha's death, Mahayana emphasized the bodhisattva ideal. Rather than seeking personal liberation, practitioners vowed to achieve awakening for the benefit of all beings, remaining in the cycle of rebirth until every sentient creature was freed. This shift had profound implications. The Buddha himself became not just a historical teacher, but an eternal, cosmic presence. Countless Buddhas and Bodhisattvas populated and expanded cosmology. New sutras appeared, claimed to be advanced teachings the Buddha had given secretly, or that had been preserved by supernatural beings until humanity was ready. Practices like Pure Land Buddhism emerged, teaching that faith in Amitabha Buddha could ensure rebirth in a paradise where enlightenment was easier to achieve. To Theravada practitioners, these developments seemed like corruptions. To Mahayana followers, they were natural expansions of the Buddha's compassion, adaptations necessary for different temperaments and circumstances. The debate continues today, yet both traditions trace their lineage to that same grove at Kusinara, to that same teaching first proclaimed at Deer Park. Buddhism's journey along the Silk Road transformed entire civilizations. In Central Asia, magnificent cave complexes housed thousands of monks and preserved vast libraries of texts. In China, Buddhism encountered Taoism and Confucianism, creating unique syntheses. Chinese Buddhism developed its own schools: Pure Land, Tiantai, Huayan, and most dramatically, Chan, which emphasized direct pointing to mind, sudden awakening, and working meditation. From China, Buddhism spread to Korea and Vietnam, then to Japan, where it underwent further transformation. Japanese Buddhism developed distinctive forms: the austere meditation of Zen, the devotional practice of Pure Land, the mystical rituals of Shingon, the militant monasticism of Mount Hiei, the socially engaged Buddhism of Nichiren. Each claimed authenticity while adapting radically to Japanese culture. The most dramatic transformation occurred in Tibet. When Buddhism arrived in the 7th century, it encountered the indigenous Bon religion and produced Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle. Tibetan Buddhism preserved practices that had disappeared in India: elaborate rituals, visualization of deities, yogic techniques for manipulating subtle energy, tulku lineages, where awakened teachers deliberately reincarnate to continue their work. The figure of the Dalai Lama, combining spiritual authority with temporal power, had no precedent in early Buddhism, yet became one of Buddhism's most recognizable faces. Southeast Asia developed its own Buddhist cultures. In Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos, Theravada Buddhism merged with local animism and royal authority. Magnificent temples rose from jungle floors. Borobudur in Java, with its concentric circles representing stages of enlightenment. Angkor Wat in Cambodia, originally Hindu but later Buddhist. Shwedagon Pagoda in Burma, supposedly housing relics of 4 Buddhas, including Gautama himself. Yet even as Buddhism flourished across Asia, it faced persecution and decline. In India, its birthplace, Buddhism gradually weakened. Hindu reformers incorporated Buddhist insights while maintaining caste hierarchy and Vedic authority. Muslim invasions destroyed monasteries and libraries. By the 13th century, Buddhism had effectively disappeared from the subcontinent where it began, surviving only in isolated pockets and in the memories of millions across Asia who practiced forms the Buddha himself might not recognize. The disappearance from India is Buddhism's great historical irony. The teaching spread to nearly every Asian culture, transforming billions of lives, yet vanished from the soil that produced it. Scholars debate why. Perhaps Buddhism's rejection of caste made it vulnerable when Hindu reform movements offered similar spiritual liberation while maintaining social structures. Perhaps its dependence on monastic institutions made it susceptible to physical destruction. Perhaps its very adaptability caused over-assimilation, absorption back into the Hindu tradition from which it emerged. Yet the core teaching survived: the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the fundamental insights about suffering, impermanence, and non-self. Whether practiced in Thai temples or Japanese meditation halls, whether understood through Pali or Sanskrit or Tibetan or Chinese, whether framed in Theravada or Mahayana or Vajrayana terms, the essential discovery remained: liberation from suffering is possible through understanding its pruvic causes and walking a path of ethical conduct, mental discipline, and wisdom. In the 20th century, Buddhism underwent another transformation: its encounter with the modern West. Western colonialism in Asia initially involved missionary attempts to convert Buddhists to Christianity, but some colonizers became converts themselves, struck by Buddhism's rational approach, psychological sophistication, and emphasis on personal experience over blind faith. The World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893 introduced Buddhism to American audiences through articulate Asian teachers. Interest grew among intellectuals dissatisfied with traditional religion. The Beat generation of the 1950s romanticized Zen. The 1960s counterculture embraced Tibetan Buddhism. By the late 20th century, Western Buddhism had emerged as its own phenomenon, often secular, psychologically oriented, stripped of cultural trappings but maintaining core practices. Scientific research validated what practitioners had known experientially. Meditation produces measurable changes in brain structure and function. Mindfulness-based therapies entered mainstream medicine and psychology. Major corporations offered meditation training. Buddhist concepts like mindfulness, compassion, and non-attachment entered common vocabulary. The Buddha's insights, tested by modern neuroscience, proved remarkably accurate. Today, over 500 million people identify as Buddhist. Countless others practice meditation or incorporate Buddhist concepts without formal affiliation. The teaching that began beneath a tree in rural India has touched every continent, speaking to human concerns that transcend culture. Why do we suffer? Can we find lasting peace? What is the nature of mind? How should we live? The Buddha's victory was not military conquest or doctrinal dominance. It was something subtler and more enduring, an invitation to investigate consciousness directly, to test teachings through personal experience, to discover whether liberation is possible. This invitation required no faith in the supernatural, no acceptance of authority, no abandonment of reason. Come and see, the Buddha said. Test this teaching. If it works, use it. If it doesn't, discard it. This empirical approach gave Buddhism remarkable resilience. When scientific discoveries contradicted Buddhist cosmology, Buddhists adjusted cosmology but maintained core practices. When cultural practices became obstacles rather than aids, new forms emerged. The teaching adapted because it was never primarily about beliefs, but about training the mind to see clearly. Consider what the Buddha achieved in a single lifetime. He transformed himself from confused prince to fully awakened being. He articulated insights that anticipated findings of modern psychology and neuroscience. He created practices that billions would follow. He established an institution that survived 25 centuries of war, persecution, and cultural change. He did all this without writing a word, commanding an army, or claiming supernatural authority, only through clarity of insight and skillfulness in teaching. The man who died between sal trees at Kusinara left no physical empire, no written texts, no appointed successor. He left only a method, the Eightfold Path, and an example, the possibility of awakening. Yet this has proved more durable than any kingdom. Empires that seemed eternal have crumbled to dust. Languages have died. Civilizations have vanished. But the teaching that suffering has causes that can be understood and transcended continues to speak to the human condition. Walk into a meditation hall anywhere in the world today. Watch practitioners sitting in silence, training attention, investigating consciousness, working to understand suffering and its cessation. They are doing what the Buddha did beneath the Bodhi tree 25 centuries ago. The technology he discovered, systematic mental training leading to liberation, works as reliably now as then. Culture changes, technology advances, but the fundamental structure of human consciousness, the basic problem of suffering, and the path to freedom remain constant. The Buddha's final words, "All conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive with diligence," echo across millennia. His body decayed, as he knew it would. The kingdoms that supported him have vanished. The languages he spoke are dead. Even the tree under which he awakened is long gone, though its descendants still grow. Everything conditioned has passed away, exactly as he taught. Yet something unconditioned remains, the possibility that any conscious being, in any time, in any place, can wake up, can see through the illusions that create suffering, can achieve liberation not through grace or luck, but through understanding and effort. This possibility does not depend on the Buddha's continued existence. It is built into the structure of consciousness itself. The Buddha simply discovered it and showed the way. 2,500 years after a prince walked away from paradise, after an ascetic sat beneath a tree, after a teacher walked dusty roads, the invitation stands: come and see, test this path. Work with diligence. Liberation awaits, not as reward for belief, but as natural result of clear seeing. The Buddha did not create this liberation. He discovered it, walked the path to it, and shared the map with anyone who would listen. The map remains. The path still exists. The destination is still reachable. All that is required is what was always required: the willingness to look directly at suffering, to understand its causes, and to walk the way that leads to its cessation. In this sense, the Buddha never died. The body between the sal trees was just a body elements that arose, persisted briefly, and dissolved. But the awakening that occurred under the Bodhi tree, the teaching proclaimed at Deer Park, the path walked for 45 years, these cannot die because they point to something beyond death, beyond birth, beyond all conditioned existence. The Buddha's story is complete, but the story of those who follow his path continues. Generation after generation, each practitioner discovering for themselves what he discovered, that consciousness can understand itself, that suffering can be transcended, that liberation is not just possible, but inevitable for those who strive with diligence. The wheel of Dharma, set in motion at Deer Park, still turns. The light that dawned at Bodh Gaya still shines. The path that began with one man's desperate question, "How can we be free from suffering?" remains open to all who choose to walk it. This is the Buddha's immortal legacy, not monuments or scriptures or institutions, though all have their place, but the living possibility that any being, through their own effort and understanding, can wake up, can see clearly, can achieve the peace beyond all understanding. The invitation stands: come and see, the path awaits.